Welcome to the Bill Walton Show. I'm Bill Walton. Well, today we're back with Brandon Weichert, who's been with us many times, who's a national security analyst and now at the National Interest and author of 4 best-selling books on national security. And also, I'm really happy to have Brian O'Shea joining us, who's an investigative journalist at the Daily Clout and host of Investigate Everything in Daily Clout. And he's got looks like 3 decades at least of deep experience in the intelligence world and operations in the field. And I would call myself more of a dilettante in this area of national security, and I want to learn from these two about what's important right now. The thing that concerns me, of course, is we've got maybe 7 weeks left before President Trump is inaugurated, and the world seems to be growing more dangerous by the day. And we have things like Russia apparently inventing a new type missile to lob into Ukraine, and then we've got a lot of movement in Syria and the Middle East, and I just heard in the Balkans as well. And so I wanted to get a picture for all of us of where we are and how we ought to think about it. And so, Brian, let me kick off with you. You were talking just before about how you see how you see things shaping up right now.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. Good to see you both. What I'm seeing right now, especially with Ukraine, is there seems to be a drumbeat to get boots on the ground. So there's a couple things that led up to this. First of all, obviously the election happened, then all of a sudden it was okay for Ukraine to use those short-range missiles or intermediate-range missiles that have been sitting there for like 6 months. Then after that, right after Biden's visit recently to Peru, the last person he met with was Xi Jinping prior to authorizing the use of those missiles. And then on the Sunday show right after that, we had Jake Sullivan on PBS who's talking about, hey, we've sent them all this money, all these weapons, nothing seems to be turning the dial. What they really need is to mobilize manpower. To me, that sounds like they're trying to prep the U.S. audience to get boots on the ground, which will really create a quagmire in Ukraine that'll make it really tough to just get people out of.
So is this an attempt to pin Trump down when he's inaugurated?
I think it is. I would refer to Brandon on that. He's more on that
Brian,
DC
Brandon,
side. While
Brandon,
I was...
you want to take that? Is this a nefarious scheme?
It certainly looks like it. Now, a colleague of mine, Mike Benz, has been saying for 2 weeks that he thinks that Biden and Trump are actually coordinating this. I am not convinced that's what's going on. I think that this is the Democrats and Biden and the globalists of the West trying to basically hem Trump in, because they know that Trump, if left to his own devices, will get a deal in his first 100 days, a ceasefire over Ukraine, which will then basically negate the last 4 years of Biden's failed foreign policy, and they don't want that.
Yeah, I'd
Brian?
agree with that. Yeah, I would totally agree with that too. And I would I'd recommend when people think about this, I know Brandon does, when we see these big moves, not every plot is coordinated. So for instance, the authorization of the, what do you call them, Brandon? The ATACMS
Yeah.
made by Lockheed Martin, that was really, the drumbeat for that was really amplified by the Texas congressman, who just happens to have Lockheed Martin in his adjacent district. McCall, thank you, Mike McCall. Yeah. And so they, they really push these, so the point is a lot of these things are about money. It's not just about locking Trump down. Think of it like those big whales that kind of move and then all the little fish attached to eat the algae. That's how I kind of look at the defense contractors and the politicians and the opportunists in these situations. So they're parallel, but they're not always coordinated.
Yeah, I think that's
well. I'm shocked that the Biden administration would put their legacy over over national security interests, but maybe I'm not shocked.
Well, we'll never really know Biden's plan until it's revealed.
Yeah. Hey, what about this missile that they fired? Pronounce it for me.
The Oshrenik.
Oshrenik, yeah.
Yeah.
Is that a game changer, or is that just cobbling together pieces of existing
No,
weaponry? And
it's a game changer. Actually, I was communicating with our mutual friend Stephen Bryan about hypersonics in general in the last 24 hours, and he told me, he confirmed what I've said to you in the past on the show, is that Russia is light years ahead of the United States in terms of practical applications of hypersonic weapons. So we've got all the theories in the world, but we don't have actual real world working systems. The Russians not only have these systems, they've got 3 or 4 different classes of them, of different lethality. And the Oshrenik, which was used against Dnipro about a week or two ago in response to the ATACMS being used by Ukraine, which were fired into Russia, that Oshrenik was a signal to the West that we have a weapon in Russia that can reach anywhere in Europe, and there is no real active air defense that can stop it. And that's not necessarily because of the speed. That's important as well. It went about Mach 10. But that's more because a hypersonic weapon performs radical maneuvers on its way down to target before it MIRVs. It separates into multiple independent warheads and then it hits. Those radical maneuvers stymie conventional air defense systems. I have been told the only defense system that America has is this THAAD missile system. We've only got about 7 of them, and those batteries, and we're not going to be sending those in to Ukraine because the fear is that the Russians will be able to destroy them and we won't be able to replace them in a timely manner.
Well, didn't we go in? I mean, the illusions that the Biden administration had and NATO when they went into defending Ukraine the way they did, and also the illusion that they're going to force Ukraine into NATO and Putin wouldn't respond, but that we ought to talk about that. But I think we're seeing, though, that as a result of this war, most of the conventional weapons that the West has, and now it looks like nuclear capability, where we thought we had superiority, we do not. And in fact, if you look at the utility, where the NATO countries are in terms of buildup of defense, Europe's now become undefensible.
Oh, it's completely indefensible. And I would just say about the nuclear issue, Bill, our nuclear arsenal has been basically withering on the vine for about 20 or 30 years now. There's a great book in 2013 by Paul Bracken, and I'm forgetting the title of it now, but he basically did a deep dive assessment, and he found that most of our I think it's almost a third of our nuclear weapons, if fired, might not be able to be fired because they've been in such disrepair. It used to be during the Cold War, one of the highest honors you could have as an Air Force officer was to operate a nuclear missile silo. After the Cold War ended, it became like where the third tier officers went. Nobody wanted that. So you don't have the talent and you don't have the technology. And then the policymakers, notably Obama, the policymakers, though, they tried for 30 years to sort of diminish the importance of nuclear weapons for our national defense. Obama famously, after he did a New START deal with Russia in 2010 that allowed for Russia to build out their nuclear weapons arsenal, he then turned around and hemmed in our nuclear weapons arsenal, saying that he wanted to get to 0 nuclear weapons in his lifetime. And so now we're seeing the fruits of that. We're seeing the results of that short-sightedness, where the Russians have a very modern, robust nuclear weapons capability, not only with conventional nukes, but also with these hypersonic weapons, and we don't.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I just want to kind of amplify for the audience that, thanks to my 13-year-old son, who is my primary education in Russian weaponry, he's fascinated by it for some reason. But we were looking at the different capabilities, especially that Russia has. And these weapons today dwarf what hit Hiroshima by miles. So for instance, I think it's called the Satan II from Russia. That's got a 15-kilometer fireball. And that is just terrifying. And so Brandon's right. They've just been continuing on their nuclear program, and we've left ourselves exposed. And I think by design, I could get into that a little later on why I think that is.
Yeah.
As in terms of what's going on with the disillusionment of Biden, obviously, I think we can always say Biden in quotes because this man doesn't seem to be able to find his way out of a jungle in Peru.
Can't walk on a
But
beach.
yeah, but he looked really good in his Crocodile Dundee denim. Um, but the thing is, I really have always said since this whole thing started that it was a replacement for the ATM machine for the defense industry and for the politicians that Afghanistan had been.
Yeah.
And August 15th, 2021, we hand Afghanistan over to a fictitious ISIS-K, which is really just Taliban with another name.
Yeah.
And then February, like 6 months later, we got to go to Ukraine. And it was really interesting because a lot of the NGOs were set up prior to the first bombs dropped in Ukraine. And so it's almost like the entire apparatus was set up prior to, and then right around October 2015, people were beating the drum on, trying to do that with Tucker Carlson saying, we got to go to Ukraine. And, hats off to Tucker. He's like, why? Like, why? And so it does seem to me like the war in Ukraine is designed to be one of these forever wars just to replace Afghanistan.
Well, we've been pushing back on the Ukraine from day one. But you said something interesting. They were setting up the NGOs before Putin rolled across the line. I mean,
Yes.
These are the relief organizations, and
Yeah.
so they were. So this, the charge here is this has been an American proxy war trying to get rid of Putin.
Yes.
And it's been a complete failure, and we've slaughtered hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how many Russians I know most of the statistics come from the Ukrainians, so I'm not sure what the casualties actually are. But this is cynical beyond belief if that was true. And also we basically had defense contractors standing by ready to profit from it.
Well, and the crazy thing is that the defense contractors weren't ready. They wanted these contracts, and yet they couldn't even set aside all the morality of it. It's terrible, but they couldn't even meet the need, because what we're finding is that Ukraine 3 weeks ago only had about 50 ATACMS missiles. They've now blown through about 30 of them. My count is between 30 and 40, which means they've only got about 10 of those systems left. They have maybe a little bit more of those British Storm Shadow missiles,
Storm Shadows, yeah,
which is similar to the ATACMS, but basically they're basically running a full house off a pear. And they just expect that somehow the Americans are, and I think this is where this is going. The expectation is we're going to knock over this beehive in Russia, and we're going to not have enough of these resources to hold out against them, and that's going to escalate into NATO then needs to step in directly, because the Russians are not going to be deterred by 50 ATACMS and maybe 50 or so Storm Shadows. It's just not going to stop them. They're fighting a war of attrition. This is the classic Russian way of war. They win wars of attrition.
And they do. And if you watch, I mean, you have to go to Rumble and find those kind of nerdy guys that are tracking these things on satellites, like by the pixel.
Right.
But if you really, I've become one of those. But if you're right. I mean, it's classic Russian style of fighting where they move up and they secure. They move up and they secure. They also do this thing that I've observed where they draw their enemies in, almost like that, you punch a blob in the Marvel comics and your fist gets stuck. And they do seem to draw them in and then encircle them and then crush them and move in on them. But I think
they did to the Nazis.
Totally. Yeah. And I think what people should really pay attention to beyond just the, dramatic, visions of those Russian missiles, which were just honestly awe-inspiring, but the chess player behind them. Yeah. So here you have Putin saying, hey, we're lowering the threshold for the use of tactical nukes. And then Zelensky fires missiles. Yeah. And he had the restraint to hold back and wait for that because he knew he would. He knew Putin knew Zelensky would fire those missiles, but he could wait through all that and then he just nails them with these, this hand of God type missile.
Yeah. Well, I also think that Putin is keenly aware that Biden is out of office in 50 days or so. And so I said this on other shows before. I think you and I 2 weeks ago spoke about this, Brian. I think that the globalists are going to go crazy trying to provoke a situation with Russia that Trump can't get us out of. But I think ultimately Putin is smart enough and wily enough to know that the American leadership that's doing this to him is going to be gone in about 50 days. And so he's got to just basically hunker down and hold out until Trump's inaugurated. Now, the interesting thing is going to be, because it looks like they're nominating General Kellogg to be the Ukraine envoy for Trump, who is more of a hawk. He was Vice President Mike Pence's national security advisor, so that should tell you some of his politics. It's going to be interesting to see, though, if actually Trump is going to get sabotaged from within again, like he did in his first term. My only thing to that is it looks like Kellogg wrote a paper in April of this year for America First Policy Institute where he was working, and it actually sounds very reasonable. And I think if Putin doesn't get provoked so badly that he's forced to react, I think we'll be okay until Trump gets in office, and then we'll get a ceasefire.
Well, I worked with Kellogg in the 2016 transition, and he's a neocon. I mean, he essentially was part of the
he's a Pence guy.
And so, why did Trump pick him?
I see it. Oh, go ahead.
No, Brian, please go.
I mean, I see. Knowing Trump as we all have read about him, I've met him once, but I see it as a kind of waving a stick at Putin. Like, look, I got the neocon hawk. He's ready to rock. Where you negotiate. And I think on the back end, what Putin's going to want is to maintain the levels of exports of gas and oil to the United States that they have now, which were like their third largest customer since the start of the Ukraine war. So I think that's what Putin will want. Like his biggest problem is going to be like, okay, if they're going to open up oil in the West, that's kind of a problem. Europe's going to keep buying it from him, so he doesn't have to worry about that. They never stopped, but he needs that, and I think, Trump, what he always does is he always, no one ever knows what he's thinking. But my guess on that pick is it's kind of a bit of a negotiating type of chip in the game. Like, look who I got. I can let him run this, or I can run it. Depends if you negotiate with me.
But Bill, it is interesting. It is interesting though, because he is a neocon, Kellogg, but yet he wrote this deep policy paper in April. And I don't know, maybe he was just trying to pitch himself for the job, but it was very clear that he is going to push for a peace deal as well as Trump. So it might be that Brian, he's right, that this is just the carrot and the stick approach. Ultimately, I think Putin knows this. They've had time to study Trump in Russia, and they understand he's going to drive a hard bargain. And there's ultimately a place for a deal. I mean, you're a deal maker, so you know this, Bill, better than I do. There is a middle ground here where everybody can get something. And so I think ultimately this is all just sort of the great dance before negotiations begin.
Well, and Keith's allowed to change his mind. I mean, looking at the evidence, it's clear that the thing has been a disaster. The thing I don't understand is NATO. Is Jens Stoltenberg still head of that, or has he moved out? But he's been an unbelievable hawk in this thing, as have the Brits. And the Brits have an army that's smaller than the army they had when they fought to preserve the colonies in 17 whatever it was. I mean, you've got all these people with nothing on the shelf to defend themselves, acting like like Elmer Fudd.
Yeah, they're the Chihuahuas nipping at your
what's this about?
I would just say this, and Brandon is, I love being on with Brandon because he's like the Rain Man of geopolitics. This guy's got so many facts in his head. So let me bring a little humorous comparison as I see NATO. NATO is like that girl in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days who sits in the movie theater, picks a fight with the big guy, and says, "My boyfriend will kick your butt," and we're the boyfriend. Now we're stuck with it. They're always picking fights with our military, essentially.
It's true.
Well,
It's
have
true.
have we committed any soldiers there? I mean, it would be special ops. I mean,
Officially or unofficially? What are you
Right.
looking for here?
well, officially, of course not. But what's really happening?
We have counter artillery in Georgia right now with
Mhm.
a private contractor advisors since the
Mhm.
beginning of this thing.
Yeah, and more importantly, I live not far from Naples. There is a gentleman from Naples who was former Navy SEAL who they claimed was AWOL from Syria, who was killed last year in heavy fighting in Ukraine. And I do not believe for a second that this guy was a volunteer. I believe he was a CIA. I think he was CIA. I know we have CIA paramilitaries all over that country. We've got special forces in advisory roles. Anybody who
Hmm.
studied the Vietnam War knows likely those advisors are going into combat as much as the Ukrainians are that they're training.
Yeah.
I actually talked about 2 years ago at the start of the war. There was a contingent of Australian special forces who
Hmm.
were there under the flag of Ukraine's foreign brigade. But as this guy told me, we were absolutely working for Western intelligence. That was our we were there because of Western intelligence. That's where they wanted us. And so, we can go
Western
on about
intelligence, is that an oxymoron?
it certainly is in this case. It seems
The
that
last
way.
4 years.
Yeah, it's not grand strategy anymore. It's great stupidity, and that's where we are.
So what happens with NATO? Because it seems to me, Trump famously told NATO they've got to pay their dues, and what is it, 2% of GDP that they're supposed to cough up, but
Three.
Yeah.
Yeah,
or
yeah,
3%.
yeah.
Well, Stephen Bryan, the
Mhm.
brilliant Stephen Bryan, reported out a great report that showed the Germans were paying even more for military supplies than the Pentagon does, and it's just
Mm.
a complete waste of their defense budget, and they're not getting any bang for their Deutsche Mark or euro, and euro. It seems like NATO has outlived its
Absolutely.
usefulness.
I think it has, and I think look. I think Trump has shown with his pulling out of the WHO in his first term that he will do it, and I think they're taking this seriously because in the last like month or so, you've seen Poland really ramp up their border defenses, and they're talking in NATO like this is some novel concept. They're like, "Hey guys, we may want to up our defense budgets because we really need to start like protecting ourselves." And
Mhm.
I'm listening to this going, my God. And then, of
Mhm.
course, Canada, like, I think they've been below like 1.9. It's an embarrassment. And I have a lot of friends in Canadian Special Forces, but I don't think they could even fight a war right now.
No,
And everyone's and they're on the inner circle there, the Security Council.
let me just give you a fun anecdote. I've been, for the national interest, doing a deep dive on Canada's military capabilities, and needless to say, it's not going very deep because there's so like in terms of submarines, they're celebrating in Canada. We're going to build 12 new nuclear submarines by 2036. How many nuclear submarines do they have now? They've got 4. 2 of them are in port at all
Right.
times. This is like the 1990s Russia, with how they couldn't field the Navy really. Canada is one of the worst sick men of the NATO alliance, and so in my
Yeah.
opinion, NATO should go away. I don't know if it's going to though, because some of the people Trump has surrounded himself by again seem to be more of sort of that Atlanticist mentality where we have to have NATO. I do think though Trump is going to basically be the landlord collecting overdue rent, which is fine.
Hmm.
But I think in an ideal world, NATO goes away because NATO is the provocateur. It is the reason why we have been in every major fight at least since 2011. Remember, Libya was a NATO operation. Syria
Hmm.
was to some degree, at least with Turkey, a NATO operation. And now everything going on in Eastern Europe and Russia, this is all NATO's doing. And NATO can't handle it. It's really just America coming in and saving everybody. And we can't do it anymore. We don't have the defense industrial base for it,
Exactly.
and we don't have the military for it anymore. We're barely holding it together as it is.
Yeah, and I would agree with that totally. And not to mention the long standing like MFOs in Port Said and all of these long standing kind of like defensive missions that we've been doing with NATO.
Yeah.
I think Brandon makes a good point. I could see him being the landlord collecting rents. That's a great way to reference it. And Trump can also do what he almost did last time, just pull all our troops out of Europe,
which
and say,
happen.
okay, we'll stay in NATO. You guys pay your share, we'll stay. But you better come up with some troops. You better come up with, your share of this. And if you get attacked, then maybe we'll deploy troops. We'll talk about it, but get them off of Europe.
Yeah.
So they're not
taken
for
wires.
granted.
We don't want tripwires.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's get into Putin's mind. Let's suppose all that happens, and
I love the way he sings Blueberry Hill. So I think secretly he's a hopeless romantic.
Putin on the Blitz.
Well, he is in a way, in terms of restoring the Russian empire to its greatness. But does he then, if that happens, does the way they sold the idea that we had to be as aggressive as we were in Ukraine was that if Putin succeeded in Ukraine, he would then roll on to the rest of Europe. What do you think about that?
Can I go really quick?
Yeah, go take your time.
I get into so many debates about this with younger people. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
I think that argument defeats itself. So the same people that will tell you that you got to stop him at Ukraine, otherwise democracy all over the world will fall. But then the same people are saying, hey, Ukraine's beating the Russian army. And so my argument there is like, okay, well, if Russia can't get past the Ukrainian army, which seems to be largely now made up of 18-year-olds and 86-year-olds, what are you worried about?
Right. Well, yeah, and if I can just pick, I'm sorry.
What are the casualties on either side that you guys suspect is the real number?
Well,
go ahead, Brandon.
Well, the Russian side, I think, is at least 500,000. The Ukrainian side is similar to that. The really interesting thing about Ukraine is something like 1/3 of its population has been depleted. I think they've lost like 24 million people. I always get this number confused. We can look it up later, but they've lost almost 1/3 of their population, either through being killed, captured, or refugee flows out of the country.
Yeah, I heard it dropped from roughly 40 million to 25 million.
That's it. That's the one. Yes. Yeah, exactly. So that's about a third. Yeah. That's even more than that. Yeah. So there's no coming back from this for Ukraine. For Russia, they've lost a lot of people. I spoke to a woman, actually, the wife of a friend of mine back in a month ago, who her father died, and she's from Moscow. So she went back to Moscow to bury her dad. And she stayed there for about 6 weeks. And she said that in terms of Moscow, she said the city was like never before. She said it certainly was more vibrant and alive than it was in the Soviet era. And she told me that the war in Ukraine for Russia is very similar to what the war in Iraq was for the Americans, where it is deeply divisive. It is politically toxic for Putin. And yet the core contingent of Russians, because of Russian national pride, they want to win. They want at least Putin to walk away with the territories he had before. They want that to be officially recognized as Russian territory, which is where you're going to get the basis of a deal. Right now, you can't do that, though, because the globalists don't want to even recognize the territory that the Russians have held, at least since 2014. So, there is this sort of divisiveness in Russian society, and they've lost a lot of people, but they're committed now. And when Putin says this is an existential war, most Russians agree. And when you're talking existential wars, you're not talking about someone who's going to give up very easily.
And you also, a great point you make there is they have the national pride.
Right.
And they have the youth pride. Like that blows my mind. If you go to any popular like Russian, I don't know what you call them, pop bands or anything. I mean, they have like the sexy girl bands, in Russian military uniforms doing like some pretty cool hip hop. I mean, they've got the backing of the people. And these are also, I don't want to say acceptable losses for the Russians, but they're not new to them. And bear in mind,
20 million people in World War II. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just in their own training exercises, like in the 80s, they do live fire exercises and real troops would die. They actually have monuments in Russia. And you're like, what is that? He died at the Battle of that. I've never heard of that. Well, it was an exercise. So I'm not saying yeah, I'm not going to get in Putin's head, say whether or not he cares about his soldiers, but I will say that the Russian people care about their country.
Right. Right. Yeah,
So
and I think that's key.
what are the knockoff effects here? I mean, let's hope that Donald comes in and Kellogg's successful and we reach some sort of negotiated stand down and Putin saves face. It seems like Zelensky's gone, uh, but there's spillover. You were talking about the Balkans and some other, and of course, Brandon, you wanted to talk about what's happening in Syria. Is all this erupting because of
Yes.
The way we've mishandled Ukraine?
Yes, and it's all connected. It's all connected to Ukraine. So basically, I think it was either with you, Bill, or Brian. I previously made the comment that basically, if Trump can get in and in his first 100 days get a deal over Ukraine, suddenly the knock-on effects are the Middle East crisis dies down a little bit. It becomes more manageable because the Russians aren't going to be poking us in the Middle East because there's peace in Ukraine, which is their big deal. That the situation between Trump and Kim Jong-un can get better because Kim will not be getting paid to support the Russians anymore. And the Chinese and Russians will naturally start to drive a little bit apart because they won't be united by that Ukraine war, which will not be going on anymore. Conversely, the longer the Ukraine war goes on, the more it gives nefarious actors on both sides, but notably in Western intelligence, the ability to basically muck things up even more. And that's what you're seeing in places like Syria especially, but also Georgia, where there's these protests erupting, and the president there, who's pro-EU, has stayed in, I think, many months after her term ended, just like Zelensky. What you're seeing in Syria, what you're seeing in Georgia, this is not organic. This is the coordinated effort of Western intelligence services that are committed to stopping Trump from being able to negotiate a ceasefire over Ukraine, trying to antagonize the situation on the Russian periphery so much that even if the Russians got to deal with the Americans on Ukraine, there's going to be so many inflammation points elsewhere. Russia will continue to be an enemy, which is what they want. They want Russia as an enemy all the time.
Yeah, that's a great assessment, and it's interesting that I was just listening. I forgot which show I was listening to, but they were talking about how now that the neo-Marxists, the left, whatever you want to call them, the neocons, have really taken a beating from Trump in terms of trying to influence outcomes. That's gone back to Europe, where that's really where a lot of this stuff, it doesn't originate, but it's a globalist type of effort against nationalist and populist leaders. And so you're seeing a lot of like the censorship comes out of the UK, and you're seeing the same like kind of a color revolution playbook. They're ramping it up again all around Russia instead of here in the United States, and it'll eventually come back here too. But I think Brandon's absolutely correct. They have to keep Putin as the bad guy. Right. I mean, if you see the way they clip his when he addresses the world about such as the use of ATACMS and everything, they always clip it so he looks the worst, and you have to really dig to find the entire transcript. Where I'm not saying he's a good guy or a bad guy. What I am saying is he's for his country,
right? And
they don't want people to see that. Just like they try to vilify the Hungarian president and the Serbian president and the Japanese prime minister who was assassinated, just the same way they do with Trump and El Salvador as well. So any nationalist populist type leader, they will vilify, and Putin is the easiest one to do so because he's, they can control that message a lot more. And the Georgia thing's very, very interesting because we've had such a big footprint there of black operations since the beginning of this thing. So it's really easy to mount these protests. God knows they had plenty of practice creating fake protests here in the United States.
And in Ukraine.
So what about the globalist agenda? It seems that with Trump coming in, it's been a populist wave and an anti-woke wave. And that has a knock-on effect with a lot of the countries in Europe and the populist movements there. I mentioned I mentioned on this show, but I'm vice chairman of CPAC, and we hold CPAC conferences in places like Hungary, where you see people in Hungary wearing MAGA hats. And there's an affinity, I think, to what's happening in the United States with a lot of the other European countries, and a real deep distrust of the globalist institutions in Brussels. And I know, Brian, I think you're also a member of the Sovereignty Coalition, and we've been fighting to keep the WHO from claiming the right to tell us what to do in case of a next pandemic. This is sort of a multi-part question, but what's this mean big picture?
Well, my take on it big picture is there's multiple vectors of attack from the globalists against, sovereign nations. I want to just say the United States. So yes, we've beaten back the woke, but we also have to be careful that you're going to have infiltrators into the new alt media, new podcasts, everything, and be on the lookout for those very popular conservative podcasts that just pop up with tons of followers. That would be my move if I were them. But also right here at home, we have to pay attention to, the constant attacks against people's privacy and property. And we're seeing this play out with FEMA down there in North Carolina. What's happening with the land down there is connected in some way to the One Health type initiatives I've talked about, and things like Justice 40, where FEMA's using these declarations to pretty much take people's land and federalize it. And so there's Brianna Sogdell, who I'm going to have on. She, one of the topmost beef regulation experts in the country. She wrote a whole policy paper on this, and they'll declare they'll declare an emergency. Biden signs off on it. Then they can go in there and tell you whether or not you can even rebuild.
Right.
And then that's why people are getting like $4,500 checks, for homes that used to be worth $250,000 or more. So I think people really need to look at the war on us and the war on free people all over the world. It takes many forms, and it's not always a Red Dawn situation. It's coming at us in the boardrooms. It's coming at us in the courts, and it's coming at us sometimes from people we think are there to help. And I think it was Reagan that said it best. If they're from the government, they're probably not there to help. That's paraphrasing, but so I think when people think of warfare, they need to think of warfare the way that Chinese think of warfare. And that is, don't look at the hardware. Don't look at the boots on the ground. Look at the software. And the software, according to the two men that wrote Unrestricted Warfare of 1999, the software of war is the purpose of war. Right. So however people can obtain what you have, that's what you have to be on the lookout for.
Right. Yep.
Unrestricted Warfare was written by the Chinese military officers that basically talked about fighting a war in 3 or 4 or 5 different dimensions. And that in fact, they basically showed all the cards, and if anybody was paying attention, we might have done something about it, but they've executed that brilliantly.
Oh, because we've been ignorant. Yes. Yeah.
Brandon?
Yeah. I think Brian is right. And I think the thing in the Carolinas is very interesting, because there's also, from what I'm hearing, and we don't have to get too deep in this because I'm still learning about it, there's some weird connection to Ukraine as well with some of these land grabs. It's the companies that are involved with trying to get the land, the resource mineral rights in Ukraine are the same companies trying to annex the resource mineral rights in North Carolina in particular, because there's a lot of rare earths under the soil there. And so there's definitely weird connectivity between what's going on abroad in the empire and what's going on at home in the empire. If Trump, so if Trump comes in and Trump people don't realize this, and maybe this, Bill, because you're a master of the universe. Bill, Trump though had to make a lot of deals behind the scenes. This is why he has a former Jeb Bush person as his chief of staff, Susie Wiles. Susie's very well known down here. I've met Susie many times. This is why he's got Keith Kellogg, as you said, a neocon. This is why he's got all these he's got the big tech guys now behind him in ways he never did. He's got Bill Ackerman and Jamie Dimon, the finance bros. He's got them behind him in ways that he never did. It's because I believe he knew going in, I have to cut deals behind the scenes to make these people happy so that they flip to me. It's the same thing with those Arab Americans who vote Democrat. He had to make deals with the Arab American community to flip them going into the election, and it worked. And so part of that deal making, though, is he's going to have certain people around him who probably are not MAGA, and we're going to have to guard against that, because things like these domestic mineral rights, who controls the land, who owns the land, this is key. And by the way, Bill, I mean, we were on the CPAC stage talking about this to some degree, you and I, with Margaret Bylander. Right? Yeah. And this was her big thing. Remember, she was going off about Kristi Name. Well, now Kristi Name is the DHS secretary, and apparently Kristi Name has not been good for private property rights in America. No. So there's a lot of connectivity here. So if Trump, he's got to guard against these special interests that he's had to align with, because they will take him off track. And if we're not careful, we're going to still be in NATO in 4 years. We're going to be in the Middle East in 4 years. We've got to really start, undoing a lot of the last 30 years. And so that's going to be the big question here, is who he has around him by the end of the transition. And will those people have the kind of sway to take him off course, or will he be a bull in a china shop and stay on point? I don't know.
Well, one of the things that I've experienced coming out of the world of private equity and finance and investments, and I was very myopically focused on that, and then got into this whole policy area, which is fascinating, but it's gotten very, very murky, because, in the old days, we used to have the United States security interest, and it was us against the bad guys, call it the Russians or whomever, and them. Mm-hmm. And now it seems like we've got a problem where the enemy's not without, but we get an enemy within, which is what Trump has referenced from time to time. And so we deal with these things, but if you've got the globalists and the neocons really embedded inside the Trump administration, we might not likely make the progress I think we have to.
It's definitely going to be, I don't think, my hope is that I'm wrong, but I think that Trump will be generally successful. But I think that in some of these key areas, he's not going to make much headway, not only because he's only got 4 years, but because of the sort of roadblocks to him.
Well, it seems like people like us, though, have to keep their feet to the fire. We can't just say, well, gee, he won the election, he's come in, and then we're going to, all these issues that we have about our sovereignty and our personal freedoms, those are not going to go away.
They're timeless.
We're going to still be fighting that fight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We were just talking about that on our 6th car ride of the Thanksgiving season yesterday. My wife and I, and actually my really intelligent son got involved. But people, you're right. I mean, people need to understand that, like, for democracy to work, for this experiment to work, everyone's got to do the work. And so there seems to be too much of a tendency for people to sit back on their laurels and justify it by saying, well, I pay taxes, he should do his job. But the enemies are within. I would even say the enemies are all around. When I look at the neocons and whatever we call them, I see it as, headquarters is China. The forward operating base is what I call the INTs, or the WTO, WHO, all of these internationals. And then the conduit, the backdoor into the United States, is Health and Human Services, which has a budget 10 times larger than DHS's. And that's how the globalists are able to get within our communities, right down to our school nurses, and especially, believe it or not, through veterinarians who don't have to report to the state. They can report right up to the USDA. And so
that's an important point, that the vets are not state, but they got to report directly to their Lord Master in DC.
That's why there's so many veterinarians involved in both One Health and the pandemic, because that is the back door into people's private property. Because especially, I won't go too into it. One Health approach.
Explain One Health. You might do a better job than I might, but it's an interesting and problematic.
Sure. And I think it's important, and it applies, because you could even Google One Health in Ukraine, and they have like a whole effort there, through which is brought out there by USAID. But One Health is this holistic approach, this paradigm shift in the way public health is treated, from treating the sick to treating holistically the environment to produce equitable outcomes for plants, humans, animals, and the environment. That covers everything. So the whole theory there is like, okay, to prevent the next pandemic, we may need to put all you people here in this city so you don't push into the jungle, thus causing spillover. And that's really what it's about, is controlling everything to prevent the next pandemic, which is why the lab leak theory was so viciously attacked. It wasn't to just sell vaccines. It was to sell and keep selling the One Health concept, which is trillions of dollars in investment all over the world. And what that, if you think about that approach to health, that allows health officials to pretty much do whatever they want, which is why the pandemic treaty, which is built on One Health, is so dangerous. And it's coming at us again in May. Yeah. And to wrap up this point, the veterinarian thing's really, really interesting, because I found a YouTube video of the One Health, I don't know, there's a million of them, but it's like the One Health Initiative or the One Health. But these lawyers, international lawyers, talking about, well, how do we get past sovereign laws? How do we get past local laws? Veterinarians. Because if your animal is sick, the veterinarian needs to come onto your property and take a look around and see what's going on there. And then they report it right up to the federal level, whereas doctors during the pandemic were reporting to the state, and not all the states were reporting because they didn't trust reporting to the federal government, or they didn't have the capability to. And that was a big problem. So you can get intel from private homes right up to entire communities through the veterinarian services. And just to bring this point home, if you look at all the Peter Daszak emails that were FOIA'd and
from EcoHealth Alliance.
Yep, the CEO of EcoHealth Alliance, who was essentially the bag man for the NIH going out to Wuhan.
And for Fauci.
Yep. You see, it's tons of veterinarians. And I'm not talking like zoonotic researchers, or I'm talking, pets and paws down the street, like going to like funerals for an EcoHealth employee, like hundreds of them. But I always say this on every show I'm on. People need to remember that the 2018 One Health framework was written by the World Bank and EcoHealth Alliance. Yeah. So this whole thing is a way to literally take land and take property and corral people into 15-minute cities, which sound like prison camps to me, without firing a single shot. And who do we know that controls the WHO? Of course, China does. And WHO directly connects with Xavier Becerra over at HHS, who ends almost every speech with "One Planet, One Health."
Well, it's funny for people listening to this and hearing about this, thinking we're going to be talking about hot wars in Ukraine and then ending up where we are right now. These sorts of plans are on the World Health Organization website. It's on the United Nations website at great length. I think they've got their environmental services or CDC environmental website. Accounting, long stuff, detailed stuff about how this is going to work. And I assume it's on the World Bank website. So you can check it out firsthand to see just what they're up to.
And Brandon said it right. It's all connected, and that's not conspiracy. It's this man brings his receipts, and so do I, and it's all connected. Go ahead, Brandon.
Well, I was just going to say, not only that, it is fifth generation warfare, which is basically the concept that you're using all measures of society to wage war and to achieve your objectives, not necessarily through direct warfare. In fact, direct kinetic fighting is the last resort for these people, because they don't want to have to deal with the headache. And so this is yet another example. And, in my book, Biohacked, I talk about the new biological warfare. It's not being done with, traditional biological weapons. It's being done with gain of function tests. It's being done with these things that are supposed to be helping to cure people from illnesses. And that's being weaponized. And they're using the civilian sort of world as a conduit for backdooring and developing very robust new forms of biowarfare.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
on that happy note,
and that's a great book, by the way. His Biohacked is wonderful. Not wonderful.
Biohacked. That's book. Brandon.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about that.
He gave me a whole hour to talk to him about this and scare the bejesus out of him.
Yeah, I think
he even has a section on Pigman, because I made the joke about Seinfeld and Pigman, and he's like, "Oh, it's in the book." I'm like, "Oh God."
Well, Brandon's left me speechless many times. But it
many people.
turns out to be real. Now, is Tulsi Gabbard HHS?
No.
She would be DNI.
DNI, Director of National Intelligence.
Well,
I think
who's running HHS? Who's
Isn't that
appointed
going to Kennedy?
HHS?
Isn't that
It's
RFK?
going to be It's supposed to be Kennedy right now.
Do you think?
Xavier
Do you think?
Becerra.
Do you think Bobby Kennedy understands what we're talking about?
Yes.
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 I think he's a perfect pick. It's always a lawyer position.
The issue is going to be, though, who he surrounds himself by. I know he knows a lot of people, and so that's not really my concern, but can he get those people in, and can they wrangle the bureaucracy? Because the bureaucracy is it's the same thing with these people at CIA. It's the same thing with DOD. It's the same thing with DOJ. The bureaucracy has a method for dealing with bosses they don't like. They're going to clam up and drag their feet and basically wait him out. So can Kennedy go in there and basically knock heads together in such a way that it's going to force those bad actors in the bureaucracy to either self-select out or be fired?
Well, and he does have a great, having Dr. J. Bhattacharya put in charge of NIH. And for those that don't know, HHS sits above NIH. CDC,
and even Dr. Oz
FDA.
at CMS. That's going to be key too.
These are all subs to HHS. And so having Bhattacharya there, the real function of NIH, let's just face it, is to decide who gets grants or not.
Right.
And that's a major, just having Jay Bhattacharya, who is a friend of ours, and he's a great guy, and he's was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. If, I would say just cut off the funding immediately, because then that's going to be a major blow to HHS's influence down to the county level. They do tend to go around Congress by influencing, for instance, through cutout NGOs, which I reported on in 2021, they were able to influence directly the Los Angeles Unified School District. And that's why there were so many masks and everything, because they had money coming right from HHS.
So one of the actions that Jay's going to take is shutting down grants to all these bad actors.
Cut off Baylor first in Texas.
Yep. And then University of North Carolina and University of Maryland as well.
Yep.
Does he have the clout to do that? How much pushback's he going to get?
They're going to get pushback like you wouldn't believe, but I think these guys have nothing to lose, and that's a good thing.
Well, that's
true.
We were at the brink. Had Trump not won, I don't like to think.
Well, Bill, my wife and I were talking about moving to Argentina.
Yeah, I think a lot of us were.
So, yeah.
Then there's also Uruguay. What is it? Montevideo is supposed to be pretty nice. But
I like Argentina. I don't love their pizza though. they make such a big deal about it, and I was all excited, and I got it. It was like a big piece of cake with some sauce. No offense, I love Argentina.
So for now, we're here and we're fighting the good fight.
And we'll keep fighting.
Well, but it strikes me that if we've got Elon Musk, and I see an interrelationship between what Doge could be about and some of the problems we're talking about, because it's one thing to think about going in and cutting costs, but the real way, as I've spent a lot of time in private equity, the real way you get at cost is, should we be doing any of this? And, should this department exist? What's the purpose of that? And there's a way to get in these agencies like HHS and beneath where it's ostensibly cost cutting, but you're really examining what they're doing. And you're taking, it's like I don't know what the metaphor is for the deep dive examination, but you can learn an awful lot about bad stuff happening through the process of auditing these agencies.
Well, and Bill, the one thing I will say, though, that is really worrying me about Doge is that it's not going to have oversight over the Government Accountability Office. GAO is going to be a big problem for Doge because they're going to get in the way and they're going to meddle. I just wish there was some way Trump could make Doge sort of on top of
why
GAO.
Why did that happen? Was that a flaw in the design, or what?
Well, the GAO is a federal bureaucracy that's been around for decades. They have control. They're congressionally mandated. Doge is just a creation of the incoming Trump administration. So they'll have some leverage, but not. Ultimately, these bureaucrats know, well, the GAO has our back. And so Trump's going to have to really put people in the GAO who are going to kind of clean house there to give Doge time to go through and do all of these audits.
Yeah, I agree. And, actually Bannon he was down with a bunch of, donors right after the election saying, hey, we need your best and brightest. We need your auditing teams. We need your due diligence teams, not just your check, to make this happen.
Yeah.
Right.
I like the idea of Doge being out there because, I think a great purpose for Doge would be to work from the smaller agencies up and start making examples of them, because
That's right.
at a minimum, they'll create, maybe not a no-go zone, but a slow-go zone where people will think twice before they actually go and just throw money at things needlessly. So I like the idea. It's almost having Doge out there is like having a sniper out there in the woods. It's going to slow everything down for the bad guys. But I agree with Brandon. If you don't control GAO, you don't control a lot.
Right. And also, I'll just say to your example, there's an old Chinese saying, strike the chicken to scare the monkey. And that's what Doge, I think, is going to do.
Love it. Yeah. Is that from the 36 stratagems?
Yeah.
Yes.
It has to be Chinese, right?
Yeah.
The
36
Chinese
stratagems of war is ruthless.
The Chinese, by the way, the Chinese have this weird love for Trump and Elon. So maybe there's some hope also that we'll avoid World War III entirely, because there's this love of those two guys among the Chinese people. It's very
because they make
interesting.
money.
Because they make money.
They love making
Right.
money. I mean,
That's right. Who
the
doesn't?
thing is,
Liberals.
but especially the Chinese. I mean, and this is the Chinese people will take this as a compliment. I guarantee it. Like those little like cats that wave, when you go to China, those are waving money in. They have a god of money. Right. There was a Chinese comedian on Netflix. I forgot his name, but he's really funny. And he's like, just send in the Chinese to fix your budgets. We love money. And so
go ahead.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Doesn't this put Xi at peril, though? Because he's become a hardline Marxist and they shut down a lot of the capitalist system. He's rounding up tech entrepreneurs for direct investment in China is slowed to a trickle. Seems to me, I've heard the Chinese called the Jews of the Orient, and that they're very business oriented. And by the way, I mean that as a compliment.
I hear you. Yes.
David Goldman has said that.
I'm all for it. I mean, most of my career in Wall Street was spent amidst the tribe, so I'm a big fan.
My wife, who's Jewish, the first thing she said to me, I was heading off to work. I said, "Hey, honey, I'm sorry, I got to go to work. We're gonna change this plan." She's like, "Hey, you're going out to make money. That's great."
That's good. Higher purpose.
I will tell you, for China's stance, I have heard from people affiliated with the CIA who say that China is actually hopeful that Trump will come in because they think they can get a deal with him. I don't know, though, what they're thinking when they say that, because Trump was the hardest president on China since probably Eisenhower or Truman. So it's very odd when I hear this from analysts at the CIA. I don't know if that's their own personal sort of bias talking, but Xi is in a pickle, and I think the reason Xi is doing a lot of what he's doing, where he's sort of now going full Marxist, I think it's because he's preparing to go to war. You don't need to be a free market capitalist if you're preparing to go to war. You need troops, you need tanks, you need them basically saluting and saying yes, sir, to everything you do. And if anybody questions you, you're going to purge them like he just did to their defense minister last week. You're going to purge them and say they're corrupt. So that's the thing that worries me, is as the economy declines in China, they're going to get more desperate and more significantly violent, outwardly so. One other thing I'll just add. There is a very high degree of talk among the Trump national security team, all of whom are Iran hawks, and I am as well. But the concern that I have is that if we go kinetic against Iran in the Trump term, it's going to basically cut off China from their access to Iranian oil, which on the one hand is positive, but on the other hand, what that will do is it will further collapse the Chinese economy, and it will make them go kinetic against Taiwan or the Philippines or both sooner than we want them to.
But we would also have to cut off their, as of October 2023, they started importing oil from Venezuela.
Yes.
As soon as Biden lifted those sanctions.
Yeah,
So
no, I know.
I know you. I know you knew probably before I did. But the thing is, it's like, I think there's a good effect. Like, I don't think we would need to go kinetic against Iran. I see it going the opposite direction.
Yeah.
We stop the container ships from, China for 6 months, you could literally collapse our economy. But
Yep.
not only that, we isolate China, and that kills the money flows going into places
Yep.
like Iran and stuff. So you do solve a lot of problems.
That's
I
my
don't
hope
think
that we don't go
Yeah.
kinetic against Iran, because it's looking like there's a lot of people around Trump who want to go, bombs away on Iran, and that will feel very cathartic, but it's going to cause a lot of complications in the long
it's
run.
just a bad idea.
Yeah.
It's a bad. I mean, look, Trump showed that the profitability of peace, peace that was enforced with a big stick.
I don't see
but-
Trump going kinetic on Iran. I just don't see it.
I don't see him.
It's not the way to get the job done. He knows that.
I agree,
Yeah,
but I
agree.
worry about some of the people he's put around him who are going to be really
Well,
antagonizing.
But as you point out, you had to make deals with people in order to get his coalition put together.
Agreed.
But hey, guys, it's an hour long. We've been into it. I thought we would go. I could go another couple hours, but I don't have the sitability that Joe Rogan does.
I wonder, Brandon, I was going to ask, do you ever get the look from your wife when you and I are talking? Because I know.
Yes, I do. Yes. Especially when I do it out in the living room. She's like, "Get out of here already! We got the kids."
So let's
My
agree.
wife's
If I
like,
could
can
get
I
you
use
guys,
the light now?
could I get you guys to agree to do a part 2 and maybe a part 3 sometime a little further
Bill,
out?
I'm at your beck and call. You know that.
Okay.
So
Well,
just let me know.
Well,
And
Brian,
I'm happy to be at your beck and call as well.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled to finally meet you in this
You as well.
context and talk about all this. I love our conversation, the way we wandered from this to that to the other thing to get to the real heart of the matter. That's sort of my favorite kind of chat. Anyway, Brian O'Shea, thank you. Where can we find you? You're at.
I'm on X at Brian O'Shea. That's with an I. Brian O'Shea SPI. And then over at Daily Clout, you can find my show called Investigate Everything, and that's dailyclout.io, also on Rumble.
Love it. Thank you. Brandon?
Thank you.
Well, you can find me usually on Twitter at @WeTheBrandon, and you can find my books wherever they're sold. I would recommend just do Amazon, because that tends to be the easiest place for people. Might have a show we get going, Brian and I don't know. We're talking about it, and we'll see.
Just do it.
We should just do it at this point. Yeah.
Okay, guys. Well, before you do that, you got to come back through me. We're going to make it happen.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have you on.
We're already set up to go. Hey, this is great. So anyway, guys, thank you. And thank you all for listening, watching the Bill Walton Show. As you know, you can find us on YouTube, Rumble, Substack, all the major podcast platforms, on CPAC website, et cetera, et cetera. And then if you like this, please subscribe. Tell your friends to subscribe. And we'll be back soon with content a lot like this, although this show sort of set a new bar for an interesting conversation. So thanks, Brian. Thanks, Brandon. And thank everybody for joining.
Merry Christmas. Mm-hmm.